I'd like you to go to the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 24. 2 Samuel 24. This is the last of these books that we've been going through, verse by verse. 2 Samuel 24, the culmination of the reign of King David. It says in 24, 2 Samuel, verse 1, "Again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, 'Go number Israel and Judah, the host out throughout from Dan to Beersheba, and number ye the people, that I may know the number of the people.'" This is a huge thing. This might be just as big as David's sin with Bathsheba, the census. And that census brought a judgment on Israel. In the book of Chronicles, now let me read how that reads. It's in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Very same episode, only from a different vantage point. 1 Chronicles 21, and the way it looks, it's very confusing for some. Verse 1, "Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel." So in Samuel, it's God that's against Israel. Now, there are censuses in the Bible. But the point about the censuses in the Bible is there can only be called by God. You can't, the thinking is, kings are shepherds. And you can't count for yourself what isn't yours. The children of Israel are not David's. David is a hired shepherd. God is the shepherd. Like David said, the Lord is my shepherd. So therefore, there's only one way you can do a census, and that is if God told you to do the census. Now, God told Moses to do censuses, 2 of them. And there's a law about censuses. And when God calls a census, then part of that census number is that each one is to be charged a half shekel to redeem their souls. Okay, they belong to God, and they have to acknowledge that they've been purchased by God by paying a half shekel tax. But this is totally different. This is King David at the prime of his life, at the height of his career, having won many glorious victories, and feeling full of himself and doing what any powerful, successful person is tempted to do. He wants to know how powerful he really is. He wants to know militarily how strong he is, economically how strong he is. He wants to know where he's at by virtue of statistics, numbers, people, and counting. The problem with censuses, only God can call a census of his people because the people belong to God. They don't belong to David. David was full of himself at the flush of his victory, and like many people who've been given victories by God, that's the most tempting time, not when you're in trouble, but when you're on top of the game. And that he was premier. I mean, he had possessed all the land. He had subdued all the pagan tribes. He had been given victory after victory after victory after victory. And at that point, this worldly idea came into his soul like it does with so many of us when we're on top of it. Man, I wonder how much I have. I wonder what power I have. I wonder where I'm in with the standing with all the other kings. I wonder how much military power I have. The king said to Joab, the captain of the host, which was with him, "Go now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan even to Beersheba, and number ye the people, that I may know the number of the people." Joab, captain of the host, verse 3, said to the king, "Now the Lord thy God add unto the people how many soever they be, 100-fold, and that the eyes of my lord the king may see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" There's his warning. Sometimes warnings come from unexpected places. Joab is not a prophet. Joab is not a holy man. But he says, "King, I pray to God we have 100 more than you even want. But why do you, and notice, delight in this?" What is it you're looking for here? And notwithstanding, the king's word prevailed against Joab. So Joab's warning went unheeded. And against the captains of the host, so evidently they remonstrated. And Joab and the captains of the host went out from the presence of the king to number the people of Israel. And they passed over the Jordan and pitched in Aroer on the right side of the city that lies in the midst of the river of Gad and toward Jazer. And they came to Gilead and to the land of Tamtimhadshi. And they came to Danyan and about to Zidon. So they went over into Jordan, what we call Jordan today, all the way up to Lebanon. So when they'd gone through all the land, they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Took them 9 months to do the census. And Judah gave up the sum of the number of the people unto the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. This is a military census counting fighting men. And David had the rule over 1,300,000 men. Now that in the ancient world would be impressive. Wow. 1,300,000 fighting men. Someone tries to warn you. You just push them aside. You want it. You want it. You do it because you want it. And then when you do it, dread comes in because you know you did the wrong thing. And then when King David's heart smote him after he numbered the people, and David said unto the Lord, I've sinned greatly in that I've done. And now I beseech thee, O Lord, take away the iniquity of thy servant, for I've done very foolishly. He humbly confessed a serious, serious sin. Now let me talk a little bit more about this, okay? He delighted. He wanted to know. It had nothing to do with what God was telling him to do. It was God that removed his hand of restraint. Any king, even a God-centered king, is still going to have humanistic temptations. And I'm going to read just a brief passage from the Law of the Kings in Deuteronomy 17 to give you an idea of why this was wrong. What was wrong with this? What was such a serious thing that as soon as David did it, his heart smote him and he trembled and he knew he'd done something very, very serious. Deuteronomy 17 verse 14. He said, when you come into the land which thy God gives you, and shall possess it, and shall dwell therein, and shall say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set a king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee. You're not supposed to have a foreigner, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he would multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto thee, you will henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart not turn away. Neither shall he multiply to himself silver and gold. The Law of the Kings is basically summed up like this. I don't want you to be worldly. I don't want you to trust in the things that worldly kings trust in. I want you to be a king dependent upon your God. By the way, horses, they didn't go to war with horses. Gentiles did, but not the Jews. When Saul and David went to battle on foot. In Saul's case, it was on foot with sharpened sticks. They were brave. They really did have to trust the Lord. David was on foot. They were facing Iron Age armies that had chariots, but they were on foot. They would multiply wives for political reasons. And one of the things that I think is interesting that he did is that he commanded every king to begin their reign by writing out with their own hand the Torah of God, the first 5 books of the Bible. There's something about that kind of interaction with Scripture that really gets it into you, makes you think very heavily. And that's what the kings would do. Okay, so David did that, no doubt. But here he is, powerful, successful, and high on what he mistakenly considered his success. And so It's his pride that leads him to do this census. And as soon as he began, he knew that he'd done something very, very, very serious. And he humbly, this is one of the great humble confessions of sin in the whole Bible. So, it says, verse 11, for when David was up in the morning, the next morning, the word of the Lord came unto the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, go and say to David, thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things. Choose thee one of them, that I may do it unto thee. Okay, so David is forgiven because God is a forgiving God. David is forgiven. God forgives. And then there's a sense in which David is the son of God. Okay? Because God said to David that I will make you and your children like my sons. And part of being a son of God is you're under God's discipline, like no one else. So, because we're sons of God, we're disciplined by God. In fact, the New Testament says one of the signs that you're not a son of God is if you never get disciplined by God. Chastisement is a sign of the love of God. So, the next morning, the prophet Gad came to David, and he gave David a deal that no one else gets in the Bible. I've never seen it anywhere else. I'll give you 3 choices on your punishment. Okay. This is incredible, right? You choose whichever one you want, and I offer you 3 things. Choose thee one of them, that I may do it to you. So Gad came to David and told him, and said unto him, you'll either get 7 years of famine come to thee in thy land, or will you flee for 3 months from your enemies while they pursue you, or should we just do it 3 days, a pestilence comes to land. So 7 years, 3 months, or 3 days. But any one of them I wouldn't want, right? And 7 years of famine, well, you never know how many people will die. I mean, in those days, a famine is a serious thing. People could die in the hundreds of thousands. Well, 3 months being chased by your enemies. David spent 13 years being chased by his enemies. He knows what it means to be chased by his enemies, only he's old now. Not as old, he wasn't 70, but it was later on in his reign. He didn't even want to spend 3 months being chased by his enemies. He didn't want to go through that. He'd been chased by his own son. He'd been chased in an insurrection. He'd been chased by his father, Saul, who chased him all over the wilderness. Nope. He says, I'll take 3 days of pestilence. And basically his thinking is, that's putting myself in the hands of a merciful God. 3 days of pestilence. See, because there is forgiveness of sins. Anyone that sins and asks God will be forgiven. That doesn't mean there's not consequences. The consequences have to come, see? And if you remember the way this chapter began, this wasn't God just punishing David. God wanted to bring a judgment on Israel, of whom David was a representative. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was because of the Civil War or something. But there was a judgment due Israel. So he used David to bring it by this census. So he says in verse 14, David said unto Gad, I'm in a great strait. Let's fall now into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great. And let me not fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel, from the morning even to the time appointed, and there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000. Remember David's original instruction. You go from Dan to Beersheba and count all the fighting men. So this is kind of ironic. The pestilence went from Dan to Beersheba, which is the furthest north to the furthest south, and 70,000 men died in that pestilence. He should have listened to Joab, shouldn't he? He should have listened to his general, but he didn't. Verse 16, when the angel stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it. So this judgment has 2 parts. a pestilence on Israel, and the utter destruction of Jerusalem. David saw the angel of the Lord. So did some of his people. They saw the angel lift his sword. Angels are powerful. There's an angel story in the Bible that says one angel attacked Sennacherib, a pagan king that was mocking God, and 185,000 people died that night. One angel. David looks up and sees the angel of the Lord while he's fasting and praying and crying and repenting. And he stretches his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it. But just then, with his hand stretched out, the Lord changed his mind. Because the Lord is good. The Lord doesn't have to change his mind. Everything he thinks is right. Everything he thinks is true. So in what sense does the Lord change his mind? As Habakkuk the prophet said, he prayed, even in judgment, show mercy. So Jerusalem's about to be wiped out. And then the Lord intervenes. Now, what does that remind you of? That's the end of the world. Jerusalem's about to be wiped out. And it has a lot to do with the worldliness of Israel. But then the Lord intervenes. He says, the angel stretched his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it, but the Lord repented him of the evil and said to the angel that destroyed the people, it's enough now, stop your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing place of Aruanah, the Jebusite. Now let me just walk through this and unpack it. See, this reminds us of another earlier story in the Bible, in Genesis, where a hand is stretched out to kill, and the Lord stops the hand. Does anyone remember that story? Abraham and his son, Isaac. And guess what? That story took place at the very geographical location that this story took place, on Mount Moriah. Abraham is just getting ready because he's going to obey the Lord. He's got his knife in his hand. Isaac is so willing. He sits there obediently, waiting. He's not 10 years old. He's 30. And he's bound himself. He allowed Abraham to bind him hand and foot. He's on the altar waiting to be sacrificed. Abraham's just about ready to go like that, and all of a sudden, stop your hand. Stop it right there on the mountain. And so Abraham stopped, and God said, look over there in the bushes. And what did he see? A ram with his horns caught in the thorns. In other words, his head is surrounded by thorns. Does that sound familiar? And God says, there's your substitute. There's your sacrifice. And then he said, in this mountain it shall be seen. In this mountain it shall be seen. What? The sacrifice, the substitute. Now we come back to this story. Israel has sinned. And King David has sinned. And it's a serious sin. And judgment is coming because the wages of sin is death. But the angel has his hand stretched out. He's about ready to wipe out Jerusalem. And boom, the same thing. Same mountain, same God. Stop it! Stop it. And it happened to be that the place where the plague was stopped was the threshing floor of Aruanah the Jebusite. Okay, now, first of all, a threshing floor. What is a threshing floor? A threshing floor is a flat piece of hard ground where they would take their harvested grain, but they'd just cut off the stalks of the grain, and they'd pile it on that thing, and they'd beat it with threshing sticks, or they'd have oxen walk over it, and they would try to, it's a place of separation, where the grain gets separated from the stalk, and then the grain gets separated from the chaff around the grain. So a threshing floor is a place of separation, all right, where the cheap and the worthless is separated from the precious. And you see this metaphor all through the Bible, even John the Baptist. He said of Jesus, his fan is in his hand. He's going to cleanse his threshing floor. He's going to separate the wheat from the chaff. The wheat he's going to put in his barn, but the chaff he's going to burn with eternal fire. So there's a huge separation here. And the plague ends right on the threshing floor of a fellow named Ariana. Now, Ariana is not a Jew. He's a Gentile. In fact, he is not even a private person. He happens to be the former lord of Jebus, which was the pagan city which became Jerusalem. And he had that threshing floor. He's out there with his sons threshing when the plague stopped. And he's the defeated lord of the city. And what happens next? Okay, it says in verse 17, David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people and said, Lo, I mean, his conviction is hitting him. I've sinned. Not this people, I sinned, he said. And I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house. Now this is growth. Because if you remember the rebellion of Absalom, David didn't really care that much about his own people. He cared about Absalom. Remember, Joab had to say, you better go out there and act like you care, or you're going to have a rebellion like you never saw before. Okay. But David has grown. Pain has brought him more in conformity to the Lord Jesus. He's more of a shepherd now. And he prays this heartfelt prayer, why don't you just put this plague on me and spare these sheep? I'm the one that caused this. Let your hand, I pray thee, be against me. Verse 18, and Gad came that day to David and said unto him, Go up, rear an altar to the Lord in the threshing floor of Ariana the Jebusite. There's where I want you to build an altar. Well, you can't just go and build an altar at the threshing floor because he observes private property. Thou shalt not steal. So in order to fulfill that commandment, verse 19, David, according to the saying of Gad, went up as the Lord commanded, and Ariana looked and saw the king and his servants coming on toward him. And Ariana went out and bowed himself before the king on his face on the ground. So the last lord of the pagans gets on his face in acknowledgement and obeisance to David, the king. Okay. And it says that Ariana said, Why is my lord the king come to his servant? And David said, I come to buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. I want to buy your threshing floor and stop this plague. Now, this too connects us back to Genesis. David's father Abraham, who in that same place, surrounded by pagans, this is the real beginning of the Exodus. He'd been promised that land, but he wasn't told to go in with an army and take it. Their sin wasn't yet full. Surrounded by pagans, but his witness was so strong the pagans respected him. And when his wife died, he said to one of the kings of the pagans, I want to buy a burial place for my wife. Now the pagans said back to him, we respect you so much. Your money's no good with me. I'm just going to give you that burial place. But Abraham would not accept that burial place for free. He bought it. And that real estate transaction is recorded in the Bible. You ever wonder why some things are in the Bible? What do we care about a real estate transaction 3,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago? But it is. It's in Genesis 23. There's a real estate transaction between Abraham and pagan, and he bought a cave for the burial of his family. And to this day, in the Holy Land, the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Okay. But there is a signed, sealed, and delivered transaction in the Bible. He didn't take it. He bought it. Now, one of the reasons I think that that's there is because 4,000 years ago, God knew that in the last days, one of the major controversies gripping the world, it will consume the UN. The Jews came in and just ripped us off and took the land and didn't pay for it and slaughtered the people. And that very sight, I know people are tired of my repetition, but it's relevant. The tomb of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, it still exists to this day. It's a testimony to Genesis 23. And there's a group in the UN, thank God Trump just pulled us out of it, called, not Nabesco, no, UNESCO. Yeah, you got it, UNESCO. UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, who just pronounced that tomb that it has nothing to do with the Jews. It belongs to the Muslims because it's a Muslim shrine. This is nuts. When I hear Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rebecca, Leah, I think the Jews. Don't you? But UNESCO says no. Muslims. Jews ripped it off. They have to give it back. This is one of the major controversies in the world. By the way, you notice who's missing from that tomb? Anyone know which wife is missing? It's Jacob's favorite wife. I mean, when you got four, you got to have a favorite, right? Rachel. He loved Rachel. But Rachel died in childbirth outside of Bethlehem. So they constructed a tomb for her. And it still exists to this day, Rachel's tomb. Only UNESCO just pronounced that that's a Muslim. Anyway, back to our story. Okay, this threshing floor is the very same place that Abraham offered Isaac. Exact same place. And it's the floor, and this is, see, really what this is this is the end of the Exodus right here. This is it. This is how the Exodus ends. It ends the way it began. It began with a real estate transaction. It ends with a real estate transaction. It doesn't end with blood, death, and murder. It ends with pagans being converted and saying to Abram and the son of Abram, David, hey, your money's no good with me. I'll give it to you. And both of them saying, nope, let me pay for it. And insisting. And this transaction too is in the Holy Writ. God wanted to put this real estate transaction in the Holy Writ. Okay? Because really what this is the last pagan bowing down in the Holy Land to the Jews and admitting. And this is the last possession of Holy Land, and it's fitting that it's King David. And furthermore, what this is ultimately a hopeful sign, the conversion of Gentiles. But also, it's a testament that speaks all the way to today. See, because what that threshing floor, this is fitting too. Threshing floor is a place of separation. You could say it's a place of judgment. Okay. The Bible, the prophets talked about, he's going to thresh the nations, man. And you, Israel, are my threshing instrument. What is threshing? Separating the wheat from the chaff. Separating the wheat from the straw. The first psalm is about threshing. Blessed is the man that will not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of the scornful. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law does he meditate. And then at the end it says, the wicked are like the chaff. One day there's coming a judgment, and the wicked are going to go one way, and the wheat is going to go another. And so the Exodus ends on a threshing floor, but the threshing floor becomes a site for the temple, which David couldn't build. I suppose you could say the temple of God was like a threshing floor. There was where God was. There's where sinners could come and get separated from their sin, be dealt with by the Lord, attend the thousands and thousands of divine services, and hear the blessings, and hear the pronouncement of forgiveness, and the smell of sacrifice, and the incense of worship. And so this is how we get the Temple Mount. Now, David wasn't allowed to build a temple. Remember, he said, I want to build God a house. I built myself a house of cedar. I want to build a house for God. And Nathan the prophet said, go for it, David. Sounds right. But that night the Lord spoke to Nathan and said, you go tell David he can't build my house. He's too bloody. But I'm going to build a house through him. And by the way, that very threshing floor is the most sensitive piece of real estate on earth. You would know it instantly, because anytime in the news you see Jerusalem, you see a big golden dome of an abomination that makes the whole thing desolate, a mosque of Omar and the dome of the rock. Well, that rock is the rock where Abraham offered Isaac. You know what they say about it? That's where Abraham offered Ishmael. Kind of a difference, isn't it? And anything that happens on that threshing floor to this day, at any moment, would become the spark that brings about the Armageddon situation. It's so heavy. It is so heavy. Now, Muslims control it now. This is part of the judgment of God on Israel. It's their holiest site. It's mentioned 800 times in the Bible, right? Jerusalem is 800 times in the Bible, the temple, and Mount Zion, 800 times in the Bible. And never once in the Quran. Never once. But Islam has claimed it as their third holiest site. So therefore they get the custody of it, because this whole world's anti-God. Now I remember 1967 when Moshe Dayan, in the Six-Day War, and paratroopers took the Temple Mount. And for the first time in history, for 2,000 years, the Jews could actually think, maybe this year it will be in Jerusalem. We got our holiest site back. But then, within days, Moshe Dayan, who by the way was a Jew, but he was an atheist, so was Golda Meir, he turned it right back to the Muslims. Now that was a long time ago, but I still remember wondering why. I didn't know much, but I knew that, what? But then I read a verse of Jesus that answered the question. Jesus talking about this very threshing floor we're talking about here. That Jerusalem must be trodden underfoot of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. See, our time is almost done. Can't wait. I want to go to be with Jesus. He's coming. He's coming. So, in closing, you got continuity, don't you? You got Abraham making a real estate transaction right after, on that same mountain, he just about killed his son. And the voice of God said, stop! And then he looked around and the Lord showed him the ram with head surrounded with thorns. And he said, there you go, there's your substitute. And he made a prediction. In this mountain it shall be seen. What shall be seen? See, that same range is where Calvary is. Okay. Then you got David. Sin and judgment raining down because of sin of Israel and the sin of David. And plague is hitting it. He can't say that it shouldn't be, because it should be. But he cried out to God, and God said, take that threshing floor there and set up an altar and stop the plague with the sacrifice. The substitute will stop the plague. And so then you got, just like in Abraham, you got a real estate deal between a Jew and a Gentile. And the Gentile is so respectful of the Jew that he says, your money's no good with me. Both times. And then the Jew says, no, I got to buy it. I got to buy it. And then, because of that, plague is stopped. The offering's been made. Satisfaction has been given to God. And on that place will be a temple of satisfaction and substance. A threshing floor, a place of judgment and separation, becomes a place of reconciliation with God. But all of it points to the dim and distant future. 1,000 years later, when a son of Abraham and a son of David would go up on that mountain and be mounted up on a cross between heaven and earth. And there's no one there to stop the angel's hand. The full force of the judgment. Him. He bore our sins and iniquities. Surely he has borne our griefs and our sorrows. He was smitten and stricken and afflicted of God, but he was wounded for our transgressions. He was wounded for our iniquities. The chastisement that brought us peace came upon him, and with his stripes we were healed. Amen. Thank you, everybody. May the grace of God be with you.